I want to give a shout out to my new patrons, Joey Kona and Hayden. Thank you so much for your donation.
Welcome to the world of Tales from the Trip.
I've taken Kratom on and off for about 2 years as a means of relieving mild depression and stress, and the longer I took it, the more I noticed its dissociative features. No one talks about Kratom as a dissociative or as a drug that contributes to memory problems, but I've noticed being entirely detached where months could go by and I would have little to no recollection of what happened in between certain time frames. It felt like I was on autopilot, and events that I was personally involved in seemed very, very distant and detached. I would have difficulties mentally acknowledging the fact that my body was active, that my mouth produced coherent sentences, that my legs walked, that my hands were the same ones that I could see performing numerous actions throughout the day, etc. I understood that all of these processes were happening, but it felt like I was just an observer, a parasite residing inside an active person's body and looking out of his eyeballs, living his life. Though I stopped using it a few months back, it still feels like that to an extent. I can't seem to fully bridge the gap between mind and body. I expect this to go away after some time has passed, but I can't be certain. Earlier this year, my parents developed a series of health complications that needed to be addressed. Due to the overall buildup of stress and memories of a pleasant addiction, I began to use Kratom again after several months of sobriety. At first, I used it once a week, but it soon grew to the usual 4 to 5 times a week, mainly on the weekends. This all led up to about 3 months ago when I woke up to a racing heart and had full-body convulsions, which lasted over an hour. I did not lose memory of it, but heavy dissociation was present during and after the event. I think it was due to increasing my Kratom usage several days before. I have never smoked or drank. I used a few legal highs once or twice, none of which I enjoyed. I used DXM 10 to 15 times, but that was years ago. Kratom was the only substance that I genuinely enjoyed and gladly returned to after short breaks. If DXM caused any damage, I would assume it was minimal, as I never abused the substance, and my last experience with it was over 2 years ago. I never took any prescription meds, and I never mixed Kratom with any other substance. I was off work for about a week after the convulsions due to the onset of debilitating panic attacks and an incredible mental change, which came and went in waves. Once it set in, it would continue for about 2 days, after which it would lessen in intensity, only to repeat later on. The whole process was very cyclical. The dissociation would come and go, and the panic attacks would follow a similar pattern. All this would be accompanied by strange head sensations, which worsened when lying down. It felt like my brain was swelling, or as though I was constantly wearing an imaginary headband which wrapped around my head. For a few weeks after the convulsions, there were bizarre sensations of what I can only describe as energy that seemed to originate at the top of my head before washing over my entire body from top to bottom in waves. Sleeping was also difficult, and I would experience what felt like internal hypnic jerks. No actual muscles physically contracted, but I felt as though something inside me released a very subtle echo which seemed to reverberate throughout my whole body. As unpleasant as the dissociation and head pressure were, significantly worse were the panic attacks which accompanied the overall mental disarray. They would slowly creep up and encapsulate my entire being, eventually forcing me into a state of absolute terror. There was no pain or physical sensations involved, but I felt genuine dread, the likes of which I'd never felt prior. The day after the convulsions, I had actually went to work, only to leave 3 hours later because I felt like everything was absolutely wrong and that I was, in all likelihood, going to die. Very irrational behavior, but every fiber of my being was telling me to run. I stopped using Kratom immediately after the convulsions. 3 months have passed and my sense of awareness has been improving, though I still experience intense waves of dissociation and there's definitely been damage done to my memory, hopefully none of it permanent. The head pressure is still there, though to a much lesser extent than before. I would not consider myself a psychonaut or a troubled youth. I consider myself an average young adult and have led a fairly healthy life thus far. Nonetheless, I experienced what seemed to resemble a seizure, along with continued cognitive impairment after 2 years of inconstant use. I feel as though the issues experienced by me were caused primarily, if not entirely, by Kratom, and I would like for others to approach foreign chemicals with more caution than was done by me. My main reason for submitting this information was to warn others that are young and have their lives ahead of them, and still others that form the opinion that Kratom is a harmless natural supplement that has been used for millennia by South Asians. I'm not Asian, and neither were any of the active users I knew. White Europeans had no history of Kratom usage, and for all we know, our bodies could very well process Mitragyna differently. Kratom was a very pleasant part of my life. It was my absolute drug of choice. If any of the descriptions of what I experienced seem vague, please excuse me as I am incapable of coming up with the exact terms to properly convey the sensations. P.S. Yes, I've been to a neurologist and have had a general practitioner take blood samples and all that. Everything came back normal, and I spent quite a large sum on these tests. I'm not going to look further into this topic. I was happy to hear that my brain didn't have any apparent damage, and that was more than enough. At this point, I am uninterested in doing anything outside of what I've already done. Before I begin, I'll provide some context for this report. I am a healthy 26-year-old male. I live a fairly active lifestyle and I eat well. I drink alcohol occasionally, and I don't smoke cigarettes. I've been smoking cannabis for 10 years, and I have extensive experience with psychedelics, namely LSD, MDMA, DMT, salvia, and psilocybin. I've also had cocaine, amphetamines, nitrous, prescription opiates, and various other drugs in the past, but never habitually. The only consistent health problem I've had is chronic migraines. Test results in the past have suggested that I have a somewhat sensitive liver. My blood work showed elevated liver enzymes for a period of about 3 weeks during a period of stress-induced migraines and subsequent overuse of NSAIDs, though the cause is not completely clear. This was resolved after total cessation of NSAIDs and alcohol, and my blood work returned to normal after a short period. I first came across Kratom on a recent trip to Thailand. A local friend of mine bought a bag of fresh leaves from a truck driver and gave me one. He mentioned it was a little like coffee, but with some sedating effects. It was very mild and not particularly noticeable. A couple of weeks later, a guy I met in a rural area offered me some pungent red liquid he'd brewed with homegrown Kratom. The taste was surprisingly good, and I really felt the effect this time. I'd taken a tiny amount of LSD earlier in the day, which had mostly worn off, and we were all smoking quite a lot of cannabis, but it was definitely noticeable. Upon arriving home, I was pleased to discover that Kratom is completely legal in my country. I found a reputable online vendor and promptly ordered a small amount of finely powdered Thai, Bali, and Borneo white strains. The smell was slightly familiar, but quite different to the fresh Kratom I'd had overseas. I first tried 3 grams of the Thai just to get a feel for the dose. I felt a very slight change in perception, maybe comparable to a cup of coffee and a small dose of codeine. A couple of days later, I tried a few more grams with the same effect. It was mostly unremarkable, but pleasant. I figured I'd experiment more when I had the time and put the rest aside for a rainy day. 3 weeks later, my girlfriend and I cooked up a batch of Bali strain in a pot with boiling water, about 10 grams each or whatever 3.5 teaspoons is. The taste was awful, the texture was even worse, but to my pleasant surprise, it was highly enjoyable. We spent the night sitting around, listening to records in a state of euphoric sedation. It was still quite mild. We were 100% lucid and coherent, but also paradoxically inebriated. A glass of wine and a joint amplified things a great deal though. Very interesting body feeling, incredible warmth, and fantastic dreamlike nods, reminiscent of a moderate dose of opiates. Closing my eyes for a moment would take me into incredibly vivid dreams about my childhood home. Platters of spinning colors, or rolling green fields with familiar faces, laughing and flying kites. This was great. I thought I'd hit the jackpot. A few nights later, I repeated the same process. The effects were the same, just wonderful stuff I thought. The next week I had a little more. There was definitely no craving or sense of longing for the feeling, but it was certainly an enjoyable thing to look forward to. Over the course of about 2 weeks, I took Kratom about 5 times, around 10 grams each time. After a usual enjoyable night with Kratom and a glass of wine, I awoke the next morning, feeling incredibly nauseated. I figured I was getting sick and carried on with my day. Eventually, I was overcome with overwhelming nausea and went home. I couldn't eat and I couldn't shit. I tried eating a banana and puked almost instantly. I dragged myself to the doctor the next day, dehydrated and in poor shape. They took an urgent blood test and found that my liver enzymes were through the roof. I was sent home with strict orders to go to the hospital if symptoms worsen. A couple of days later, I had become incredibly jaundiced and could do nothing but lie in bed, shaking and sweating. My kidneys were radiating pain throughout my whole body, and I had barely eaten a thing in 3 days. I was admitted to the hospital that night. After extensive blood tests and several ultrasounds, I tested negative for all common liver diseases and showed no signs of gallstones, bile duct obstruction, or anything else likely to cause such a reaction. The doctors were very baffled, and over the course of the week, I reluctantly isolated Kratom as being the cause of my condition. My specialist kindly referred me to several studies which show almost identical symptoms in others who have used Kratom recreationally. I was discharged from the hospital after a week with a diagnosis of a drug-induced hepatic injury. A month later, my jaundice is gone and I am able to eat. I'm still feeling fatigued and weak, still experiencing abdominal pains, and my liver enzymes are still abnormally high, though decreasing by about half every 2 weeks. So basically, unless you like having bright orange skin, being nauseated and in agony, and spending a week in the hospital being poked and prodded by confused doctors, stay the hell away from this stuff. Even mild recreational use can cause grave health consequences. So today, I almost died using a substance I originally thought was harmless. I am a 210-pound, 23-year-old male. I have recently been discharged from the Navy after a 4-year tour, so I am in excellent health, and until very recently, I spent a fair amount of time bodybuilding. My wife and I, feeling particularly good this morning, decided to do our stims of choice. I won't be discussing her use of stims, as she is a private person. We live in rural Alabama. There is no phone service out here, and cell phone signal is lost as soon as you enter the forest. This is important for later in the report. So I measured out 4.5 grams of ground Bali Kratom, my favorite because I hate edgy stims, and Bali has a very smooth high. Normally, I used a digital scale accurate to 0.001 grams. I put my dose in 11 00 gel caps and swallowed them down with Mountain Dew. After about 30 minutes, my wife and I were feeling great, so we began walking in the woods. We got to about half a mile out, and we started getting playful, so my wife began giving me a standing ovation. Very near climax, my heart began pounding very hard and very, very fast. I was unable to climax, to both of our disappointment, because I felt lightheaded and needed to sit down. I found a fallen tree nearby and sat on it. conversing casually with my wife, still lightheaded and not feeling good at all. This is the last thing I remember. The rest of this report is based on my wife describing what happened after I blacked out. After a brief conversation, I collapsed, falling off the log and laying on the ground, completely unresponsive. My wife felt my pulse, and my heart was basically fibrillating. I was still breathing, but barely. I do remember hearing my wife's voice, but I don't know what she was saying. She was trying to comfort me while slapping me, performing CPR, trying to sit me up, and hoping I wouldn't die. She was afraid to leave me, as she had no idea where we were, and our cell phone was at home. Not that it would have done us much good out here. She said she pulled my eyelids open, and my eyes were rolled to the back of my head. After about 30 minutes of CPR, I began to come to, and for about 10 minutes after waking up, I was so weak. The best I could do was breathe and make eye contact with my wife. After a short time of rest, my wife helped me walk home, gave me a cigarette to calm my nerves, and I began writing this report. In the end, I think I'm fine, but I'm just glad my wife knew what to do to keep me alive. I will never try Kratom again. I hope this will reach those that are contemplating trying Kratom. I am a 25-year-old of exceptionally good health. I should also preface this by stating that I have very few allergies, and I have never had any bad bodily reaction to any legal or illegal substance until I tried Kratom. A few months ago, I purchased 15 times extract after reading of the opium-like quality of this legal plant. I depleted the whole baggie within 2 weeks' time, taking a strong dosage, usually every other or third night. The effects were incredible at first. Euphoria, warmth, bliss, everything you read in these forums. By the fourth dosage, everything went wrong. Within hours, I felt an intense, steadily increasing pain in my abdomen. The pain became so great that I was eventually curled up in a ball on my couch, vomiting helplessly on the floor. At the time, I figured I simply ate a dinner contaminated with some microbe. The next day, however, I felt chills, my urine was the color of black tea, and I experienced an intense nausea. The condition would not go away. By the fifth day, I figured this was not a regular food contamination problem. My whole body and eyes were a dark yellow color. Jaundice had set in. After several blood tests and doctor's visits, I was diagnosed with cholestatic hepatitis, a non-infectious liver disorder where your gallbladder essentially shuts down for some time. My liver panel blood test showed elevated ALT, AST, alkaline phosphate, bilirubin, and serum albumin levels. There is essentially no treatment besides taking compazine for the nausea, which in itself is a horrible drug. It's used in psychiatric wards to mellow out and dumb down residents. My condition lasted 2 weeks. This was by far the worst illness I've ever experienced in my whole life. At times, I literally thought I would die. I understand that I punctuated my story with drama, but I feel it is necessary to give caution to those that want to try this substance. It very well could have been that the extract was tainted with lab chemicals. So I bought this Kratom extract that is supposed to be the strongest concentration ever, 0.25 grams being equal to 10 grams of regular Kratom. The reasoning was that it would be easier to drink, since the taste is outright nasty. I will divide the experience into two. Day 1, I took 0.25 grams and felt the regularly reported effects, euphoria and slight buzz. I felt good. The day after is when things got ugly. I developed a horrible stomach ache that radiated to my back. I could barely breathe. I felt as if I had indigestion and constipation. In an effort to clear my painful intestines, I downed some milk of magnesia. The pain had me unable to go to the gym for a week. I was almost bedridden for these days. Fast forward to day 2. 2 weeks later, I decided to give Kratom a try again, since I didn't think that the pains and Kratom were related. Boy, was I wrong. I downed 0.25 grams again, and same as last time, I got the feeling of euphoria, light buzz, and well-being coming on rather quickly, 20 minutes. I enjoyed this for 3 hours, and went to sleep sober at about 11 p.m. The real fun began at 3 a.m. when I was woken up by stomach pains. I woke up and went to the guest bedroom so I didn't wake up my wife, and I played some Xbox waiting for this feeling to pass so I can go back to bed. That didn't happen. 45 minutes later, I was on the floor of the bathroom in fetal position, gasping for air. It was the same pain that I had 2 weeks ago, only stronger. It had radiated to my back, and I could barely breathe. The pain would last for about 20 minutes and suddenly go away, only to come back again 5 minutes later. I lasted in this roller coaster all of 5 hours when I decided to drive myself to the ER. The pain was so intense, I was very worried about crashing on my way there, even if the ER is only 15 blocks away. If I pressed my hands around my gallbladder, it would feel like I was being stabbed. I got there, and I was immediately administered an IV with 1 milligram Dilaudid, and that was the best relief I had ever felt in my life. Tests and questioning began: EKG, ultrasound, blood work, CAT scan with contrast. Doctors did not find anything, with the exception of 2 very elevated liver enzymes. ALT was at 340, AST 250, 6 times normal. So I had to spend the night, with more Dilaudid being administered every 3 hours religiously, 1 milligram at the time. The next day, my liver hormones were trending down, and took a full week before I was back to normal. The doctors were all baffled, as they had no clue what did this to me. I did not disclose Kratom, as I knew that they had no idea what it was, and they'd be quick to blame it. I was released with a no raw seafood warning, since it was my last meal before this. My wife ate the exact same thing that I did, and she was fine. As soon as I got back home, I threw the Kratom away, and vowed to do more research next time I experiment with something. I still have residual pain. I hope that it will go away quickly.